June 26, 1944. Hollandia Air Base, Dutch New Guinea. The screen door creaked and the checkerboard froze mid-game. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mac MacDonald looked up from the board at the tall, lean civilian standing in the doorway. The name didn't register at first. It seemed too out of place in this far-flung corner of the world, where the jungle clawed at the runway and the ocean swallowed mistakes whole. Then, the calm voice repeated it, as if reading an altimeter. Charles Lindbergh, the man himself, the one who had crossed the Atlantic with a periscope, a prayer and fuel calculations that would make an engineer blush. He wasn't there for nostalgia. He wanted to talk about the P-38, about how the Lightning could fly farther than the manual said it could. Neither man knew it yet, but over the next few weeks, impossible would become standard operating procedure. And what if the most feared trick of the entire Pacific War wasn't a secret weapon, but a setting everyone had been warned never to touch? MacDonald studied the visitor. Operations Officer Merrill Smith watched from behind the checkerboard, curious. Outside, the 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, worked on their Lightnings between missions. The humid air smelled of avgas, hot aluminum and red clay. Lindbergh politely asked to see their combat routine. Mac didn't roll out a red carpet. He offered a seat. Dawn, 4-ship, armed recon. "You can come if you can keep up," he said. Lindbergh nodded like a man who'd just been handed a heading to the horizon. The strange part wasn't that he'd shown up. It was that he brought exactly the talent the Pacific needed most. Ruthless, almost artistic efficiency. 17 years earlier, he had flown the Spirit of St. Louis like a fuel accountant with wings, 3,600 miles on a single radial engine trimming mixture by ear, by feel, by an almost mystical sense of pressure and burn. Through the 1930s, he turned that instinct into science, mapping routes for Pan Am, adjusting performance with United Aircraft, troubleshooting at Willow Run, and test flying P-47s where the air was thin and engines finicky. He understood something few combat pilots did. The manual was an average, not a boundary. Somewhere off the chart was a sweet spot where power, heat, RPM, and pressure found perfect balance. He wasn't supposed to be here in any kind of uniform. Politics in Washington had made sure of that. But war doesn't care about speeches. It cares about fuel, range, and whether your fighter can meet a bomber where the map turns blue. So a civilian technical representative stepped off a transport plane with a battered flight bag and a face famous enough to stop the chow line cold. He borrowed a cot in the 475th's tent city and waited for dawn. The first mission was close and dirty. 4 P-38Js lifting into a ceiling of grey rain, their twin engines rumbling like church organs under a wet sky. Mac led the flight. Tom Maguire, already a wolf with 15 kills and a Hunter-S patience, led the second element. Lindbergh slid into position as Blue 3, flying wing with perfect precision. Like he had been born in the Lightning instead of checking out in one a week earlier. The target was small and mean, barges, crates, and things that shot back from the jungle edges. They weaved through light flak, the black puffs of smoke clawing upward from the trees. When they returned, the crew chiefs noticed something strange. Mac's fuel gauges were near empty. Smith S and Maguire S were to much better, but Lindbergh taxied in with a shrug and fuel. Real fuel. Where the others were running on fumes, he had reserves to spare. Once was coincidence, twice was a pattern. A week later, it was a question no one could ignore. How was the civilian coming back rich on gas while the aces came home dry? Mac called a meeting in the rec hut. Thatched roof, dirt floor, one bare bulb swinging over a ping-pong table pushed against the wall. The pilots filed in, smelling of sweat and gun oil. Some curious, others skeptical, a few visibly irritated that a man from the newspapers might lecture them on combat flying. Lindbergh didn't grandstand. He gave numbers. "You're taught," he said, to cruise at 2,200 to 2,400 RPM, mixture on auto-rich, manifold pressure low. Because heat is the enemy and detonation is death. You're taught never to run over square, never to let manifold inches exceed hundreds of RPM, because that melts valves, knocks pistons, ruins mechanics' lives, and kills engines. Silence. Then, the inevitable protest. Over square, kills engines. Lindbergh nodded. At war emergency power, yes. At 60 inches and 3,000 RPM, sure. That's abuse. But 30 inches at 1,600, that's balance. Fewer explosions per minute, each doing more useful work. Less friction, less heat. Same airspeed, same power, less waste. He wasn't asking for belief. He invited them to try it. Short legs, close to base. Rescue boats, ready. War burns away ceremony. Within days, cautious 4 ships went out testing Lindy settings. The engines sounded different, deeper, steadier, a bass note you felt in your spine, but the gauges didn't lie. Oil pressure stayed green. Cylinder heads ran cooler, airspeed held, and they came back with fuel. Real fuel, 50, 100, even 200 gallons more than their wingmen who flew the same mission by the book. Range began to stretch like a map left in the sun. 570 miles became 700, then 750. Pilots who used to dash in and dash out started to linger, 15 extra minutes of fighting time over targets once too distant to risk. Detours for weather stopped being coin tosses. The Pacific shrank. But he didn't just save fuel. He proved it with gun smoke. Efficiency earned him an audience. Combat earned him belief. Lindbergh didn't hide behind observer status. He took slots whenever Mac had them. He led elements, flew wing, and stayed overhead when the bombers turned home. He taught with a gloved finger, tapping the fuel flow gauge over the Bismarck Sea, and with his right hand forward on the throttles when flak started to climb. And on July 28, 1944, he taught with the trigger. Blue Flight found 2 Japanese Ki-51 Sonyas over El Paputi Bay. Tough little bombers with pilots who knew their trade. The first, flown by Sergeant Yokogi, caught fire and plunged into the sea. The leader, Captain Saburo Shimada, refused to die easy. He dragged the fight into a turning contest, throwing his Sonya through savage banks that made 4 P-38s overshoot and curse. Shimada had patience, skill, and luck until Lindbergh rolled in. The P-38's guns were all in its nose, 8 feet of converging death. Shimada turned toward him, head-on, a game of chicken at nearly 500 miles per hour, closing speed. Lindbergh wasn't calm. He was focused. He sighted on the Sonya's radial and pressed the trigger. 6 seconds of thunder. The Bay-50s traced glowing threads through the sky. The 20mm cannon smashed into the nose. The propeller slowed, visibly. A dying metronome. At the last instant, Lindbergh hauled back hard, the lightning flashing over the Japanese plane close enough to feel the heat through the floor. Shimada's Sonya dove, trailing smoke, and never came up again. The others saw whose burst had broken it. The kill never went on any official report. Washington would have exploded if a civilian had scored a confirmed victory. But that night, in the tents, no one questioned who had earned it. 3 days later, fate nearly caught up. A Zero dropped onto his tail in a turning fight that broke every rule he'd preached. Mac's voice tore through the radio. Break right, break right. Lindy snapped the yoke, the Zero overshot, and Mac's guns roared. The near miss was enough for headquarters. The civilian had proven his point. It was time to send him home alive. By the time he left in August, Lindbergh had flown about 50 combat missions, half of them in P-38s, and left behind a method that spread faster than rumor. Crew chiefs in the 475th began logging fuel consumption like accountants. Pilots compared numbers between squadrons. Commanders asked Lindbergh to give his talk again, under 3 bulbs this time, with twice the crowd. The specifics varied by weather and weight, but the rule was the same. Lower RPM, moderate manifold, lean mixture, trust the gauges. Within weeks, the technique had spread across 5th Air Force Lightning units. Range circles on the maps widened. Escort lines stretched. B-25s found company on raids that had once been unprotected. Fighter sweeps began reaching airfields that had been out of reach just weeks earlier. It changed more than range. It changed tempo. The island-hopping rhythm MacArthur needed depended on fighters arriving in time, not just in theory. You could start invasions sooner if your cover didn't need a nearest strip. You could skip worthless volcanic rocks if your lightnings could leapfrog them. Storms stopped being death sentences. Now they were detours. The impossible mission stopped being a brave exception and became Tuesday. And the engines? The horror stories never came. Not one V-1710 failed from Lindy settings. Mechanics didn't pull melted heads or sweep up broken valves. If anything, lower RPM reduced wear. Lindbergh had lived long enough around engines to know steady, sensible loads keep metal happy. Oversquare only kills when you confuse pressure with abuse. He didn't try to outrank anyone. He couldn't. He came as an equal, where rank meant nothing, the cockpit, where the airplane only obeys gravity and heat. He flew the long, dull hours and the short, bright minutes. He ate the same dry rations, sweated the same sweat, sat on the same raft folded under the parachute that made every hour feel like 8. He put his famous name next to an idea the world hadn't heard and risked both being shot down. In a world where institutions guard doctrine like gold, he treated doctrine as a starting point. It still is. By late 1944, the 5th Air Force had formalized what began as a hut-side lesson. Cruise charts changed. Training syllabi replaced "never do this" with "don to do this at high power." Beyond the P-38, others took note. Corsair squadrons remembered the same man had shown them how to double-bomb loads safely. Navy and Army conferences at Pax River started listening more closely to frontline reports. The wall between factory and front cracked. War got faster and smarter. Back in Washington, they might still have argued politics, but 4,000 miles away, no one cared. Pilots judged him by the only metric that mattered. Did you help me live and make the enemy die? Major Richard Bong, America's top ace, said it flatly. He was as hot a pilot as any of us. He'd have been knocking off Japs every day if Kenny had let him. You can't buy that kind of respect. The math told the rest. A P-38J with full internal tanks around 410 gallons and external drop tanks could now stay aloft for 9 hours on Lindy settings, covering over 1,000 miles with a quarter hour of fighting time and still landing with an hour S reserve. Its combat radius, once limited to about 570 miles, now reached 750. That 31% was in tier number on a chart. It was the difference between escorting bombers and arriving too late, between catching an enemy raid and hearing about it afterward, between losing a wingman to weather and hearing his laugh in the mess tent. It reached all the way to Leyte and Luzon, across the vast blue stretches where twin engines meant life and one engine meant a gamble. The 475th finished the war with 551 aerial victories, America's second highest ace Tom Maguire among them, with 38. The Lightning had always been range and firepower in a twin-boom frame you could recognize at a glance. Now it was endurance, the ability to be where you were needed for as long as it took. Legacy is a slippery word. Lindbergh went home in 1944 the same way he'd arrived, quietly. He spent the rest of the war in testing and tactics, and died 3 decades later in Hawaii with a psalm on his stone. He left behind no school, no base, no monument. Just something better, a way of thinking that cuts through superstition and asks the only question that matters in a cockpit. What do the gauges say? Beneath the noise, beneath the fear, beneath the manual, there's a point where your machine is happiest. Find it, prove it, share it. That's how the impossible becomes routine. If this story hit you the way it hit the men who lived it, if you felt that spark when the needles held steady and the range ring grew, Stick with us. Subscribe, hit the bell, and tell us below. Would you have trusted a civilian math after years of being told it was wrong? Pilots and mechanics, what never do this turned out to be your sweet spot. We read every comment, and your stories shape the ones we tell next. To the veterans and families who still carry these names, thank you. The runway's long tonight. We'll see you, wheels up, on the next one.